at Gardner Webb and was there with a friend of mine whose name is David. David's actually spoken here. He and his wife and children are now IMB missionaries serving the Lord in Africa. But David and I had known each other since junior high school. We'd grown up in the same church, wound up going off to Gardner Webb at the same time. So we're in college at the same place. And in addition to that, we're in the same dorm on the same floor. We're not roommates, but we're on the same floor. Anyway, of all the stuff that I had in my dorm room, one of the things was it was a small broom, not a big one, but just, I don't know, just kind of short, not very wide, but it was perfectly suited for a dorm room if, for some strange reason, I would want to clean, which apparently I chose never to do that. Anyway, but it still was a useful tool for me, not for cleaning, but I used it for swatting. And so if you aggravated me, I would swat you with my broom. And so there were a lot of guys that had been swatted by me in this broom, including David. And apparently one day I had swatted him and he didn't like it, and he got angry and opened the window and chunked it out when I wasn't around. And so I've gone to look for the broom, and I can't find it. And I start asking some questions, and they say, I think David did something with it. And I pressed him, and he said, yeah, I chunked it out the window. And we lived on the third floor, and I went outside, it was at night, to see if I could find this, and I couldn't find it. And apparently what had happened is the broom goes out the window, and somebody is walking along and decides, no, I guess the witch fell off of it. And so they decided I've got a free broom, and so they took the broom. And so now at this point, I'm ticked. I like this broom. I used this broom, and now my broom has been is gone. And the reason for that is because of what David did. I view myself as having been wronged, and so I need to get back at him. And so I started to think what it is that I could do to David to get back to him. And in our dorm, there were some problems, especially on the fourth floor, with bats getting into the building. And different than bats that get into the church. That's a different type of bat altogether. But these were bats that Bats would periodically get in the building, and when that would happen, though, guys would come out with tennis rackets, and they would swat these bats, and periodically you'd find a dead bat lying in the stairwell. So here I am, I'm trying to think of what it is I can do to David, and I come into the stairwell one day, and I find 2 dead bats laying there. I can do something with that. So long story short, what I did is to scoop up these 2 dead bats, I put them on a piece of newspaper, and I set that piece of newspaper on David's pillow. So David was on the top bunk of his bed, and so that night he goes to climb up into his bed. He's getting ready to put his head down and finds my gift. Needless to say, he was not thrilled about it. I was ecstatic over it. I thought it was wonderful. And all of that was done because I was operating with this mindset. You have wronged me, you've gotten me, I now get you back. One good turn deserves another. You get me, I get you back. That's how life operates. And so many times that is exactly how we operate, isn't it? It gives us great satisfaction when someone has wronged us, they've done something to us, that we can get them back, that we can somehow force them or lead them to experience some measure of cost because they have inconvenienced or they have hurt or they've caused us to experience some type of cost. That's how we operate. Let me tell you, though, some good news. God does not operate in that fashion. When individuals wrong God, God's desire is not to get even with them. God's goal is to get them right with Him. Very different. God's goal is not to get even, rather His goal is to get us right with Him. Well, that's an encouraging and a comforting thought, because think of whether it's this past week or since 2015 began, if I were to ask you to get out a piece of paper and a pen and to begin to write down the instances where you have wronged God, you may need more than a sheet of paper. You may need more than one ink pen. Because consistently and unfortunately regularly we wrong God. But again, God's desire is not, once we have wronged Him, to get even with us. His goal is to get us right with Him. But that leads us to this question. How is it that God then works to get us right with Him? We see the answer to that question as we're continuing to walk through Joseph's life. When we're today in Genesis 42. Genesis 42. Obviously, we'll be taking a break from this next week, but Genesis 42 is where we're going to find ourselves today. We're actually going to be looking at all of verses 1 through 28. We won't be reading all of those, and what we're going to do is drop in a few places. So if you would just find that in your Bibles with me and just keep that open, and we'll walk through this passage together. Genesis 42, and again the question is, how is it that God works to make us right with Him? So that when we've wronged Him, His goal is not to get even, rather to get us right with Him. How does He do that? Well, first of all, what we're going to see is that He uses circumstances to make an awareness of guilt. God uses circumstances to make or create an awareness of guilt. Now, let's set the stage here so that we're all on the same page. Joseph has experienced, at this point, a dramatic turn of events in his life. And he's really been through a horrific ordeal for a period of years. It started with his brothers betraying him, selling him as a slave. He winds up in Egypt, serving in Potiphar's house, and he's lost his freedom, he's lost his home, he's lost everything familiar to him. To make matters worse, Potiphar's wife makes up these terrible false allegations about him, and he goes from being a slave to being a prisoner, and he's sitting in for an indefinite period of time in a prison dungeon until God works through circumstances and gives Joseph the ability to interpret some dreams that the Egyptian Pharaoh had been having. Consequently, Joseph has now been promoted so that he is effectively the prime minister of Egypt. And his task for the past 7 years has been to help the nation to prepare for what they were going to experience because of what God communicated to Pharaoh through the dreams. And hopefully you remember what God had communicated through the dream, which was this, that Egypt was going to experience a total of 14 years. And the first 7 years were going to be years of tremendous abundance and plenty. There was going to be not simply ample, but more than ample rainfall. They were going to be bringing in record harvests. They're going to be having the most productive years agriculturally they've ever experienced. And those 7 years are going to be followed by the exact opposite. 7 years of absolute lack, 7 years of drought and famine. And the Pharaoh promotes Joseph to be the prime minister of Egypt to help him, or to allow him the ability to lead the nation to prepare during the 7 good years so that they're prepared for the 7 bad years. Well, at the end of chapter 41, we're told that the famine has now begun. And the rain has stopped. And at first, people probably didn't notice. A day or two passes without rain, but then it becomes a week. Things are getting kind of dry. Then it's a couple of weeks, then it's a month. And all of a sudden, the earth is getting pretty scorched. Crops are drying up. Plants and shrubs are withering. And harvests that were abundant have now become non-existent. And the people begin to start to look around, where are we going to find food? We're running out of food. Our pantries are going bare. There's nothing in the market, so there's nothing for our animals to eat. And so what they do is to go to the Pharaoh, and they say, hey, listen, we're starving here. Pharaoh then says, go to see Joseph. And at this point, what Joseph begins to do for the nation is to dispense the grain and to share out of the storehouses and the silos and the barns and all the abundance that they had been able to save for the 7 wonderful years. Now he is able to ensure that the Egyptians, they do not starve to death. And each family is able to get sufficient food so that they might be able to sustain these years of famine. But we're told at the end of verse 57 at the end of chapter 41 and verse 57, that this famine, it says it was severe in all lands. This did not merely affect Egypt. So the nations around them are also looking at scorched, dry earth. They're also looking at empty markets and bare cupboards, and they're literally thinking, where are we going to find our next meal? Might we actually starve to death? But word gets out that Egypt has grain, and so people from the surrounding nations began to pour into Egypt with the hope of and the expectation of being able to buy enough food so that they themselves might be able to make it. Well, as this chapter begins to unfold, we're told in verse 41 that Jacob, so it goes, changing the scene, we're going back home, back to Canaan, back to Joseph's father, Jacob. Jacob saw that there was grain in Egypt, and he told his son, why do you look at one another? Hey, why are you guys just sitting here twiddling your thumbs? We're going to starve to death if things don't change. There's food, I hear. There's grain, I hear, in Egypt. And he says in verse 2, I have heard there's grain in Egypt. Go down to that place and buy for us that we may live and not die. Get up, guys, and go. Well, Joseph at this point has 11 brothers that are back at home. But Jacob doesn't send all the brothers. He actually only sends 10. He keeps Benjamin back. He's the youngest. He's the one that came right after Joseph. And he keeps Benjamin back at home. But he sends the rest of them to go to Egypt that they might be able to find grain, to be able to get food. And so once they travel then to Egypt, we're told in verse 6 that Joseph was governor over the land, and it was he who sold to all the people of the land. And Joseph's brothers came and bowed down before him with their faces to the earth. So what's going on is that Joseph's brothers make their way to Egypt, and you've got to think that there were multiple dispensing stations throughout the nation. But God so works through circumstances that Joseph's brothers don't go to one of the others. They come to the exact place where Joseph is at the exact time that Joseph is there. And they see Joseph, but they don't recognize him. But they can tell just by what he's wearing and by how people are responding to him, hey, this is a bigwig in Egypt. This is somebody that's important. Probably he's decked out in the robes of regalia and the signs of power and influence. And so what they do, that they bow down before him to show respect to him. Verse 7 says that Joseph saw his brothers and recognized them, but he acted as a stranger to them. That they don't know who he is, but he knows exactly who they are. And we're told that he spoke to them roughly, and he begins to interrogate them. He says, where did you come from? And it seems, and we come to discover as the passage unfolds, Joseph is not talking to them in their native tongue. It seems that he is speaking the Egyptian language through an interpreter to them. And so he's beginning to interrogate them, saying, where are you guys from? They say, well, we're from Canaan, and we're here to buy some food because, hey, there's this famine going on, and we're starving back at home. And Joseph responds, no, that's not correct. He says, you're spies. That's what you are. He knows that's not the truth, but he's giving them a hard time. You're spies. You've come to scope out the land and see where our weak points are, that you might spread that information to our enemies. That's why you're here. And they say, no, that's not why we're here. And they say in verse 11, we're all one man's son. We're honest men. All of us, we're just brothers. Verse 12, Joseph says, no, you've come to see the nakedness of the land. You're looking for our vulnerable spots. And they say in verse 13, your servants, there were 12 of us, the sons of one man in Canaan. In fact, the youngest is with our father today, and one is no more. So they're saying, all right, there's 10 of us that are here. One is left back home, and they say one is no more. Well, who's that supposed to be? That's Joseph. They're operating under the premise that he's dead at this point. And Joseph says in verse 14, in essence, that's not the case. You guys are spies. And they begin to protest and suggest, no, we're absolutely innocent. We're here like everybody else just to get enough food so that we might not starve to death. And Joseph says, all right, I'm going to give you an opportunity to prove that you are in fact honest. And what I want you to do is to go back home and bring your brother. This one that you said is at home, I want you to bring him back with you. But you know what? I'm not going to send you all back. I want to keep one of you here, Simeon. He's going to safeguard the fact that I know you're going to come back and get him. You're not going to let him rot in jail. I'm going to send you guys to go get your youngest brother. I'm going to keep this one here. And hearing all of this, something interesting happens. You see in verse 21 that the brothers are talking amongst themselves, and they're speaking probably Hebrew, assuming Joseph doesn't understand a word they're saying. And they say in verse 21, we are truly guilty concerning our brother. We saw the anguish of his soul when he pleaded with us, and we would not hear. Therefore this distress has come upon us. And Reuben essentially says in verse 22, I told you so. All right, so Joseph's brothers are now in a pickle. They think all of this terrible stuff, this interrogation, this suggestion that they are spies, wondering, might they lose their freedom? Might they be executed? Might they be beaten? Might all these terrible things happen? And all of a sudden they say to each other, I bet this is coming because of what we did to Joseph. And all of a sudden they start talking about, you remember what he looked like when we threw him in the pit? And then we sold him to the slave traders? He pleaded with us, but we didn't pay him any attention. We did this terrible, terrible thing. And that's why all this bad stuff is happening. What's interesting is this. That had happened in excess of 20 years earlier. 2 decades have now passed. They haven't given much thought to Joseph at all. Out of sight, out of mind. In fact, the only thought that it seems they give to Joseph is to suggest, we used to have this other brother. They assume that he's dead. And you've got to think over these past 20 years that they have suppressed and repressed all the memories surrounding Joseph and what they had done to him and how they betrayed their own flesh and blood, how they had sold their own brother to be a slave. They've done this terrible deed, and for 20 years they haven't given any thought to it. But now, the screws are tight and the circumstances are difficult. And they're feeling what? They're feeling guilt. They've done this terrible wrong. They've sinned against their brother. They've sinned against God. And they've just kind of shoved that back in the closet for 20 years. And now all of a sudden circumstances have opened the closet door and the light is shined on what they've actually done. And they're feeling terribly, terribly guilty. What I want you to see in that is, I believe, how God consistently works. Which again is this: when you or I have wronged Him, when we have sinned against Him, it is not His desire to get even with us, to go tit for tat. You hurt Him, He's going to hurt you. Rather it is He's wanting to work through circumstances to bring and make an awareness of guilt so that you might get right with Him. His goal again is not to get even, rather to have you get right with Him. And the only way you'll ever do that is when you recognize there's a problem. When push comes to shove, we tend to think of guilt to be that's an awful thing. It conjures up a negative connotation. But guilt is only negative in the sense that it doesn't feel good. When in truth, guilt is actually a good thing, because it's like the indicator on your car that lets you know, hey, there's a problem. Something is not right. And what we see here as God is working in the lives of Joseph's brothers is exactly how He works in our lives, which is that He works through circumstances to create an awareness of guilt. Not to get even, but so that we'll get right with Him. Back a number of years ago, when we were in Charlotte, it was one Wednesday night. I was going home, and just before church started, I didn't have a whole lot of time, and so I was going to take a shortcut by cutting through a neighborhood. And it turns out that the police department was concentrating on that area, and they pulled me over and wrote me a ticket for failure to come to a complete stop at a stop sign. I mostly stopped. Anyway, so I've gotten this ticket. I don't want it to show up on my driving record or make my insurance rates go up, and so I did what so many others have done when they get a ticket, which is to take that class that they offer. And you take this defensive driving class, you pay the fees, and then it doesn't show up on your insurance. So it was like on a Monday night, I was going to have to sit in this class for 3 hours. I was not looking forward to it. Caroline was thrilled. She giggled, I think, the entire night. Anyway, so I go in there and I've got to sit and listen to this class led by a CMPD officer for 3 hours. And that's pretty boring. And to his credit, the officer does his best to make it as interesting as he possibly can, but he's got to keep us there for 3 hours. And one of the things that he does to help make the time pass a little bit more was to offer us the opportunity to ask questions. And one of the things when he was talking about if and when you have an accident, what it is that you should do, somebody raised their hand and they asked this question. Suppose I get into an accident. Let's say somebody hits me. Let's suppose there's 2 people in that car, and once they hit me, the driver and the passenger trade places. So that when the police officer shows up, the one that's driving says they were the passenger, and then it's just my word against theirs. What do you do then? And the officer gave a response I thought was kind of interesting. He said, if and when those instances happen, a lot of times what we will do is ask them to raise their shirts. And he says the reason for that is this. Most people wear a seatbelt. And when you get into an accident, it's going to send you and force your body against the seatbelt. When that happens, it's going to leave some marks on your body. And if you're driving, the marks will go from your left shoulder down to your right hip. And so we're going to look to see which angle it's going from. Isn't that brilliant? But it's pretty smart. And what are they doing? They are using circumstances to indicate and bring about an awareness of guilt. What I want you to understand is that God works in many ways in the same fashion. He's going to use circumstances to prompt into your mind and bring an awareness in your heart of your guilt before Him. It's not because He's wanting to, just for kicks, make you miserable and uncomfortable. Rather, it is He wants to make you right with Him. And very easily, we even as professing believers can do things and tell ourselves, you know what, nobody else knows, no one else has any idea, this will never see the light of day, and we may do these things, say these things, watch these things, or whatever it is, and we've sinned against God, and we just kind of put that in the closet, and we never deal with God about it, and it just stays there. We've wronged Him, but we just pay no attention to it. But then somehow, some way, it may be days later, weeks, months, years, or even decades, God will somehow work through circumstances to recall that to your mind, to burden your heart about it, and bring into your mind and heart an awareness of guilt. Not to get even, but rather so that you might get right. God's goal is not to get even with you. His goal is to get you right with Him, and that'll never happen until you recognize that there's a problem. So He uses circumstances to bring an awareness of guilt, but He does something else, and that is He uses goodness to make us aware of our badness. He uses goodness to make us aware of our badness. The brothers in verse 21, notice what fully they say. They say, we are truly guilty concerning our brother. We saw the anguish of his soul when he pleaded with us, but we would not hear. Do you see what they're doing? They're saying, hey, we are all in this. Every one of us was absolutely complicit and completely guilty in this wrong that we have committed against Joseph. We're all in the same boat. And they're not rationalizing, they're not excusing, they're not trying to minimalize, they're not trying to trivialize what it is they've done. I mean, this is a clear, tacit confession of what they have done and the depth of the wrong that they have done against Joseph. Now, Joseph is nearby. He hears all this. They think he doesn't understand a word, but Joseph understands everything they say. In fact, we're told as the verses continue that, verse 23, they did not know that Joseph understood them, because he was speaking through an interpreter, and Joseph turned himself away from them and wept. He had to turn his back to them. He is so touched by what he's heard that he's moved and brought to tears. And then he returned to them again and told them what was going to happen. He's saying, Simeon is going to stay here. The rest of you are going to head back home, and you're going to bring your youngest brother back with you. But before they leave, Joseph does something else as the passage unfolds. These brothers are going to head back to go get Benjamin. Simeon is going to stay in jail. And Joseph is going to send them with bags of grain so that they might have food for the journey and might be able to leave some for their father. But he instructs one of his aides. He says, whatever money they give you for this grain, put it back in one of their bags. So that's what they do. The brothers pack up, they begin to head off. It's going to be a long journey. And at some point, they stop after a day's travel. They're going to set up camp, and they begin to open up some of this grain to feed their animals, to feed a donkey as it's carrying all this stuff for them. And as one of the brothers opens the bag of grain, what does he find? He finds not only the grain, he finds the money that they paid for this. Now think about that. What would your response be? I mean, because you've done the right thing. You paid for this grain. You did the right thing. But now not only do you have the grain, you've got all the money that you paid for it as well. It would be like you go into the grocery store and getting bags of groceries that cost $100. You get home and you're taking the stuff out of the bags and you happen to find a $100 bill in there. I mean, you may tell yourself, hey, that's great. You know, I paid them, but somehow I wound up with this. You know, this is a great day. It's like I'm getting free groceries. They could have been telling themselves, hey, we got free grain here. But it's not for them what they view as good news. In fact, verse 28 says that when they saw this, that their hearts failed them in verse 28, and they were afraid. And then they say this at the end of verse 28, what is this that God has done to us? What is this that God has done to us? Now, there's a couple of ways to interpret or to take that question. And one way is to look at it in the negative sense and to say, you know what, this is God getting us. You know, we have done this wrong against Joseph, and God's just sticking it to us. And this money somehow wound up back in our bags, and now they're going to accuse us not simply of being spies, but of being thieves. God's just trying to stick it to us. There's that interpretation. But there's another way to take this that I actually prefer. What is this that God has done to us? Now keep in mind, these are brothers that have just come to grips in their mind and their heart with this terrible stuff that they've done to Joseph. They're finally, for the first time, wrestling with the real guilt of what they have done to their own flesh and blood. They've admitted it to each other. They've actually unknowingly admitted it in Joseph's presence. They are sapped with guilt. And now, in essence, they've got this grain for free. What is this God has done to us? What I believe is actually going on is that they're like, how can this happen to us? How could such a good thing, a fortunate thing, happen to us? Because we're louses. We betrayed our own brother. We sold him as a slave. We figured him for dead. And we feel so terrible about that. And what does God do? He gives us not only the grain that we need, but all the money that we paid for it. What I believe is going on is that God is using goodness to underscore in their hearts their own badness. Because quite frankly, that gets people's attention. Let me see if I can paint the picture this way. Back in Charlotte, I was on the executive committee for the local Baptist Association, and so we regularly had these meetings, and oftentimes they would begin with folks being able to share prayer requests or a praise of something positive that was going on in their life. And during one of those meetings, this pastor spoke up, and he just wanted to share this praise about something he and his church had gone through. And he began by saying, you know, some of you might be aware because of what you've seen on the TV stations or in the newspaper, what's been occurring in our church. And what happened is that this church ran a daycare, and they had an employee that for some reason needed to be terminated. And so they fired this woman, and so she's ticked off, she's angry. So what she does is to go to the newspaper and to the TV stations and just spray them up to make up all sorts of false allegations about things that were supposedly going on in that daycare. Well, that's a juicy story for news stations and for the newspaper. They begin to report on this. This causes the state to immediately launch an investigation, and the church is getting bad press day after day after day. It's in the newspaper. It's on all the local news stations. This church is just getting hammered in the media. And so the state launches their investigation, and this pastor said, you know, a process that normally would take 90 days, they were able to complete in 30 days. And it turns out that they said we were completely in the clear. All of these were baseless, fraudulent allegations. We hadn't done one single thing wrong. All of these charges were completely baseless. Now, what had gone on, though, is that the story first broke, and day after day after day, there's all these terrible stories. But then it takes a month before the investigation is done. And you know what the news media reported? What kind of stories showed up in the newspaper? Nothing. Nothing. No story, no article that said that the church was declared to be in the right, that this woman made up these allegations, that all these charges were baseless. Nothing. And the church, in response, they didn't sue the woman. They didn't make a stink or anything, but what the pastor said he did do was to send a letter to the newspaper, send a letter to the local stations, but still they didn't send any reporters out. Still no stories were written about how the church was completely exonerated. But as he's sharing this praise report, he said, you know what was interesting is that we had one of the anchors for one of the TV stations that had been reporting about us and against us. They began visiting our church. And he said, I was able to visit into their home and talk to them. And what they said, he said, I was just taken by. He said, you know, we were part of the process of reporting all of these baseless allegations against you, and this terrible wrong was done against you. But when you were declared to be in the right, we didn't say anything. We didn't say anything positive. We didn't say it was all baseless. We didn't do any of that. And you didn't cause a commotion. You didn't launch a libel lawsuit. You didn't allege her with slander. You didn't do anything. You just responded graciously and with kindness. And I was so touched by how you responded and felt so bad for how we'd operated, I wanted to come check you guys out. And what he shared is that this anchor and his family became a part of their church, actually joined their church because of how they had responded when they had been wronged. You know what? When we are wronged and don't respond kind for kind, that gets people's attention. When someone has hurt you and offended you and cut you deeply, when you don't respond kind for kind, people take note. And oftentimes when you don't respond that way, the one that has hurt you, who's offended you, who has brought this wrong against you, it underscores in their heart and their mind, man, I really messed up. I did something terrible. You know, when push comes to shove, isn't that the crux of the gospel? Now, Paul put it this way in Romans, and while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. That when we are still actively engaged in wronging God, He doesn't respond kind for kind. He doesn't try to squish us like a bug. He doesn't try to rain down judgment. He sends Jesus to die for us. And His goodness towards us, what does it do? It underscores our badness. Peter describes it this way: Christ suffered also once for sins, the just for the unjust, that He might bring us to God. That's God's goal. It's not to get even. It's to get you right with Him. And He's going to actively work to accomplish that. He's going to use circumstances to make an awareness of guilt. He's going to use His goodness towards you to help you see your own badness. Not with the primary goal of making you miserable and woeful, but so that you might turn to Him and respond to His goodness. Maybe today it is perhaps that you recognize God has been awfully, awfully good to you. Let me ask you this. Do you really think that you deserved it? Do you really feel that you're worthy of it? Could it very well be that God has been so good to you so that you might see and come to grips with just how much you have failed Him? That He's using His goodness and His graciousness towards you to help you see just how you have failed Him. Could it be that God is speaking to you today through the truth of His Word to underscore very simply, God's goal for you is not to get even, but it's to get you right. The question is, will you respond so that you might get right with Him? Won't you bow your heads with me? You know, every